Hey everyone, ready for something a little different. Today we're going deep, really deep into the economic situation in Jamaica. We're going way past those pretty pictures in the travel brochures, you know what I mean. Our guide for this deep dive is a YouTube video called Life and Debt by Papillon, Curieux 2050, and let me tell you, it's pretty eye-opening stuff. It really shows a side of Jamaica that, well, most tourists never get to see.
It does. It really does. It's a look at a country that's dealing with some really tough economic problems that go way back.
Yeah.
You know, Jamaica's journey from being a British colony to becoming an independent nation, well, it wasn't easy. And then you have organizations like the IMF and the World Bank. They've played a big role, a controversial role sometimes, in how Jamaica's economy has developed.
Yeah, the video doesn't shy away from that, does it? It really lays out this stark contrast between, like, the vibrant tourist scene and then the struggles of everyday Jamaicans. You see farmers who are basically forced to abandon their fields because it's cheaper to import produce, and then you have these local industries that are just barely hanging on, trying to survive against, like, this wave of globalization.
That's it. That's right at the heart of it. And one of the biggest things the video highlights is this cycle of debt. A lot of developing nations, they find themselves stuck in this trap. And the video looks specifically at Jamaica and how IMF loans, you know, the kind they take out to deal with the big crisis, well, they can actually lead to a downward spiral, make things even worse.
Okay, so break this down for me a little bit. How do these loans, like, actually create more debt?
Well, there are a few things at play here. First, these loans, they usually come with really high interest rates, so paying them back is a huge burden. And then there are these things called conditionalities. Basically, Jamaica has to agree to implement certain economic policies. The lenders, they get to dictate what those policies are.
So it's not just about getting the money, it's about, like, agreeing to a whole set of rules in exchange for that money.
Exactly, you got it. And a lot of times these conditions, they involve things like austerity measures, which can mean cutting back on things like public spending. And then there's trade liberalization, which basically opens up the country's markets to competition from all over the world. Now, on paper, these policies, they might seem reasonable, but in reality, they can have some really bad unintended consequences, especially for a developing economy like Jamaica's.
The video shows this one example. It's heartbreaking, really. There's this dairy farmer who's forced to slaughter his whole herd because he just can't compete with the price of imported milk powder. It makes you wonder, how does opening up trade, how does that end up hurting local industries?
It all comes down to competition. When a country opens up its markets, cheaper goods from other countries, they flood in. Now, you might think, hey, lower prices, that's good for consumers, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it can be devastating for local industries.
Yeah.
They just can't match those low prices.
So in this case, this dairy farmer, he's up against this imported milk powder that's often subsidized by foreign governments, right? I mean, that makes it even harder for him to make a living.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. And that's where this whole idea of power dynamics comes into play. Developed nations, they often have a huge advantage when it comes to these international trade agreements. Their industries, they're often more efficient, and they get a lot of government support, subsidies. That makes it incredibly difficult for developing countries to compete on a level playing field.
It's almost like a David and Goliath situation.
It really is. That's a great analogy. And the video, it uses some pretty striking examples to show this power imbalance, this unfairness. There's this one that really stuck with me about this Jamaican businessman. He's trying to import chicken, but get this, the chicken is 20 years old.
Yeah, I remember that part. It was shocking. What does that tell us about, the rules, the regulations around food imports?
It definitely raises some serious questions, doesn't it? About food safety standards and about what's really going on with these import practices. It shows how hard it is for developing countries to control what's coming in, to regulate global trade.
The video also talked about something called free zones in Jamaica, but it described them as, and I'm quoting here, slave zones. What are these free zones and what's so bad about them?
These free zones, the idea behind them was to attract investment from foreign companies and to create jobs. They're basically these special economic zones where businesses, they get to operate with fewer taxes and regulations. But the reality for a lot of the workers in these zones, it's pretty grim. It's not what was promised.
Yeah, the video showed workers in these free zones making next to nothing, working in tough conditions, and then there's this constant fear that the factory is just going to shut down and leave them with nothing. It was a pretty bleak picture.
It was. It really was. And it makes you question, are these zones actually helping the local economy? Or are they just a way to exploit cheap labor? And it's not just the pay and the working conditions, the video. It also brings up these concerns about what these free zones are doing to the environment. With fewer rules, there's a bigger risk of pollution, and practices that aren't sustainable.
So they might be attracting foreign money and creating some jobs, but it sounds like they're doing it in a way that's like hurting the environment and exploiting workers.
That's exactly the kind of complex situation we're talking about here. It's not always this clear-cut good versus bad. There are often these trade-offs, and things happen that nobody expected, consequences.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another example of that, like how complicated things can be, it's that story about the Jamaican banana farmers. The video talks about how they've always had this like protected market in Europe, but now they're facing this huge competition from these big American companies, Chiquita,
It really shows you how these old trade agreements and like the power dynamics in the world, they can really determine the fate of a whole industry.
Mm.
You see, for a long time, these Jamaican banana farmers, they had these special agreements with the European Union, preferential trade agreements, they called them. It gave them a reliable market, and it helped them make a living, support their families.
But then the U.S., even though they don't even grow bananas themselves, they challenged those agreements, saying they were unfair to American companies.
Exactly, that's what happened.
Mm.
And the U.S., they've got a lot of clout, a lot of influence in these global trade talks. So eventually, those special agreements for Jamaica, they got dismantled. And that opened the door for these giant banana producers like Chiquita to come into the European market.
And the result is, just like the video shows, a lot of Jamaican banana farmers, they're really struggling. They're getting squeezed out by these multinational corporations that can just produce bananas so much cheaper.
It is, and it brings us right back to that core problem, this imbalance of power in the global economy. Developing countries, they often don't have the leverage, to negotiate trade deals that are actually fair.
Mm.
And their industries, they become really vulnerable to like the whims of the global market, whatever's happening out there.
It's a lot to take in, to be honest. It feels kind of overwhelming. Like, what can anyone even do about these problems? They seem so big.
I get that. It's a valid feeling, and it's something a lot of people are wrestling with, economists and policymakers, people trying to make a difference. The video itself, it doesn't offer any easy answers. It's not that kind of thing. But it does really highlight this need for a global economic system that's fairer, and more sustainable.
So it's not about blaming anyone. It's about understanding that there are these like deep-rooted problems, systemic problems, and then working towards solutions.
Exactly. You got it. And even though it might feel like these problems are too big for one person to make a difference, there are actually things we can do as consumers, as citizens. We can contribute to a better future, a more just future.
I'd love to hear more about that. Like, what can we actually do to make a difference?
Well, for one thing, we can be more thoughtful about what we buy. Be more conscious consumers. We can choose to support businesses that, they do things the right way. Fair trade practices, sustainable sourcing, that kind of thing. And we can learn more about where the products we buy actually come from. Think about the impact our shopping choices have on people all over the world.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's about changing our mindset, right? Not just looking for the cheapest thing, but thinking about like the ethics, is it fair? And the environmental impact. What's it doing to the planet?
You got it. That's the shift we need. And it goes beyond our own shopping habits, too. We can also speak up, advocate for change. We can support those groups that are fighting for fair trade policies. And we can hold corporations accountable for how they're doing things. Are they being responsible? And don't forget about talking to our elected officials, the people who represent us. Urge them to make economic justice and sustainability a priority.
So it's this combination, right? Individual actions and then bigger collective efforts to push for change in the whole system.
That's exactly it. And I know it can feel daunting, but remember, even small changes, they can make a difference. It's like a ripple effect. You throw a pebble in the water and the waves go out. By making conscious choices and, using our voices to speak up for a better world, we can help create that more just and sustainable future.
That's actually really encouraging, It's easy to feel helpless when you're faced with these huge global problems. But you're right, we can all do something.
We absolutely can. And the video, it reminds us of something really important. It's all about human connection, recognizing that we all share this responsibility to create a world where everyone has a chance to thrive.
Speaking of human connection, the video did share a few stories that, they gave a little bit of hope. One that really stuck with me was about this Jamaican McDonald's, a franchise. They actually won a lawsuit against the big American corporation.
Oh, yeah, that's right. The little guy taking on the giant. It really shows you the spirit of the Jamaican people, their resilience, there's entrepreneurial drive. It proves that even when you're up against these massive multinational companies, local businesses, they can fight back. They can stand up for themselves and win.
It was like a reminder that even in this complicated system, there are people, there are communities pushing back, finding creative ways to deal with the challenges, and creating their own success stories.
You got it. It's happening all the time. And while the video mainly focuses on the struggles Jamaica's going through, it also acknowledges the strength of the Jamaican people, their ability to bounce back, to overcome obstacles.
Man, it's been really eye-opening, learning about the real economic situation in Jamaica makes you think twice about those picture-perfect vacation photos, doesn't it?
It does. It really makes you look beyond the surface. Think about all the complex things that shape a country's economy. That video, Life and Debt, it does a fantastic job, really pulls back the curtain, shows you the struggles that a lot of Jamaicans are facing, things most people never see.
Yeah, and for me, I've only ever been to Jamaica as a tourist, So this has given me a lot to think about, seriously. It makes me wonder, now that we know about these economic challenges, these tough realities, how should that change our perspective, as travelers? Or even just as consumers?
That's the big question, isn't it? And I think it all starts with awareness.
Right.
Understanding that our choices have an impact, whether it's where we spend our money as tourists or what we buy in the store. It all makes a difference.
So maybe it's about finding those local businesses when we travel, supporting them, or doing a little research, finding out where the things we buy are actually coming from, making sure they're ethical.
Exactly. You got it. And it goes beyond what we do as individuals, too. We need to use our voices, speak up, advocate for real change, support those organizations that are fighting for fair trade, and hold those big corporations accountable. Make sure they're not hurting these developing economies.
It feels like we've just, scratched the surface here. There's so much to learn. If there's one thing you want listeners to take away from this deep dive, what would it be?
Well, we've been talking about Jamaica, right? But these same things are happening in so many countries around the world. It's important to remember that globalization, it's not always a good thing. And we need to ask ourselves, what can we do to create a global economic system that's truly fair? A system that works for everyone, not just a few at the top, That's the challenge, and that's the opportunity.